Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this webinar on census response rates and reaching historically undercounted communities. I hope that you are all staying safe and healthy during this difficult time. As many of you know, Asian Americans Advancing Justice is working to ensure a full and accurate count of our communities in the 2020 census. And as a national hub, we're working to develop curriculum and materials to support your Get Out the Count work, including fact sheets, toolkits, webinars, social media graphics, translated materials, and more. And today we are excited to dive deeper into the most up-to-date analysis of census response rates collected by the City University of New York's Hard to Count map and how organizations can use this data to amplify their Get Out the Count efforts. We'll also be diving deeper into how to reach historically undercounted communities during the ongoing changes of the non-response follow-up period and doing a messaging refresher on how to continue motivating the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander community to fill out the census. As you may know, this webinar is the 18th installment of our monthly census webinar series, which we launched in August 2018. And if you missed our previous webinars and want to tune in, you can access them with the links on this slide, and also our census webpage, countusin2020.org. Today, we have a lot of incredible colleagues in the census space with us for this webinar. And first, we'll do a quick overview of our website, our hotline, and some of the resources that are available. And then we'll turn it over to our speakers and then close with Q&A. So check out our census website at countusin2020.org for all of our webinars and accompanying summary blogs. The website also hosts our toolkit, fact sheets, a list of partner resources, and more. We also have a COVID-19 page with the latest information on changing Census Bureau operations and updated field guidance. And you can find information on Census Bureau operations and the latest changes announced translated on the different language pages under our main resources. If you have any questions, Advancing Justice AAJC and our partner API Vote are ready to take your census questions. Call our hotline at 844-2020-API or 844-202-0274 for answers to your questions in English and multiple Asian languages. I should note that this hotline is strictly for answering questions regarding the census, such as how can I fill out the census online, or what languages is the paper form available in. This hotline is not meant for filling out the census. If you wish to fill out the census on the phone, you can call the Census Bureau's questionnaire assistance phone lines. And join us to celebrate Asian Pacific American Heritage Month this month in May. The AAPI 2020 Coalition is sharing census messages each Tuesday in May to lift up the importance of our communities getting counted. And our theme this May is Rooted in Community and Rising Together, to recognize the history of generations before us and the solidarity that we must keep building for a stronger future. You can sign up to get the Census APM Toolkit, which will include information and graphics on the importance of census for our communities and Get Out the Count during COVID-19. And you can use the link that's on the slide, and the toolkit will be updated weekly. Without further ado, I want to turn it over to our speakers. First, we have Steve Romalewski, who is joining us from the City University of New York who joined City University of New York in January 2006 to launch and direct the CUNY Mapping Service as a project of the Center for Urban Research at CUNY's Graduate Center, which specializes in online applications that provide intuitive access to powerful data sets, displayed visually through interactive maps and in other formats. Steve was awarded a Charles H. Revson Fellowship at Columbia University in 1995 and received his MS in Urban Planning from Columbia in 1998. He also teaches graduate-level GIS courses at Pratt Institute's Graduate Center for Planning and the Environment. Prior to joining the Center for Urban Research, Steve co-founded and directed the Community Mapping Assistance Project at New York Public Interest Research Group. And for those of you who have tuned into our webinars before, Steve led our tutorial on how to use Communities Map earlier in our census webinars. We also have Jerry Green joining us. Jerry is a veteran civic engagement professional and U.S. Census expert. As a consultant to the National Urban League, Jerry directs the organization's policy and strategic approach to ensuring an accurate count of African Americans in historically undercounted communities. And in this role, she has convened 2020 census workshops around the country, bringing together philanthropy, local and state elected officials, grassroots advocates, faith-based leaders, and census officials. And previously, Jerry was the Senior Advisor for Civic Engagement to the Office of the U.S. Census Director. And before this, she served as Chief in the Office of External Engagement with the U.S. Census Bureau, where she educated national stakeholders on the benefits of census participation and engaged historically undercounted communities of color on challenges and obstacles to obtaining an accurate count. She also managed several Census Federal Advisory Committees. And Jerry established the National Urban League's 2020 Census Black Roundtable, which comprises leading thinkers and organizers in the Black community who are committed to mobilizing for an accurate 2020 census count. She holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Maryland, College Park, and a master's degree from Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. We're also joined by Elena Langworthy, who is State Voice's Census Program Manager. And in this role, Elena works with state tables to plan for the 2020 census and aims to ensure an accurate count of the new American majority population. Elena began her career on the campaign trail and has worked on field programs at the national, state, and local level. Prior to joining State Voices, Elena worked as the program manager with the Virginia Civic Engagement Table. Elena holds a BA in political science from Colorado State University. She lives in Northern Virginia and enjoys exploring interesting areas off the beaten path. And lastly, we have my colleague Raimo Roy, who's the Program Associate for Census and Civic Engagement at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. She's responsible for working on policy research and analysis on census issues, developing communication strategies, and implementing advocacy campaigns. Raimo began working in public policy as an intern for the Truman Center, where she focused on researching policies about democracy and rule of law. She's also interned with the International Rescue Committee, where she empowered refugees from South and Southeast Asia by guiding them through the employment process and providing Urdu translation services. And prior to joining Advancing Justice AAJC, Raimo worked as a program associate at the International Republic Institute, where she helped implement democracy advocacy programs in Africa. Raimo recently received her BA in International Affairs from the George Washington University. And a huge thank you to our 4 speakers for joining us today. We will have Q&A at the end, and you can use the chat box or questions box to send your questions, or raise your hand to have your line unmuted so you can ask the question yourself. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please also use the chat box or questions box to send us your questions. And this webinar is recorded, and we will send out the recording and presentation after the webinar. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Steve Romalewski with the City University of New York.
Greetings, thank you very much. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. And I am going to, if you can go to the next slide, that'd be great. So we have, as you may know, if you listened to earlier webinars with AAJC that we've done, or if you're familiar with our work on census issues generally, since October 2017, we've been working very closely with civil rights groups and the national funder community to try to help organizations, census stakeholders, prioritize where they should be really focusing their get out the count efforts, their census education work, their outreach more generally. And the main vehicle for that has been an online map, the Census Hard to Count Map 2020, that initially, when we launched it, highlighted areas that were considered hard to count and provided a wealth of population and demographic information about those areas, so stakeholders can use that to really hone in on where they should be prioritizing their work. And then in March of this year, when the Census Bureau started to publish so-called self-response rates, which I'll talk about, which this slide highlights, we kind of transformed the website so it would provide information about those self-response rates so people can see in almost real time how their communities are doing in terms of households submitting the questionnaire on their own and what the result of that might be when the non-responsive door knocking phase starts after the self-response operation is over. And Now it's a little bit of a different situation with the extended time frame, with all of the challenges that we're facing because of the pandemic. But anyway, we're continuing to not only map this information, but also analyze it on a weekly basis. We give presentations every Friday to national funders and stakeholders so they can kind of put the response rates in context and understand what's going on nationally, and then translate that down to their local communities. So what are self-response rates, and what does that mean? So basically, when you as a householder submit your census questionnaire, you are self-responding, and the information gets sent back to the Census Bureau, and the rate of self-response is basically the number of households that have responded on their own as a share of the universe of addresses that the Census Bureau, or known housing units, that they contacted back in March to invite participation in the census. And I point that out because, number one, it just gives you a sense of what I'm talking about. But number two, the flip side of that is what can self-response rates not tell us? So we don't know anything. The response rates themselves don't tell us anything, excuse me, about who has responded. We don't know anything about the characteristics of the households that responded. So we don't know if more or fewer households with kids under 5 have been responding. We don't know if kids under 5, for example, are being undercounted yet. We won't know any of that until the census count is done. All we know now are the number of households, regardless of how many people are in them and regardless of who those people are, that have responded. But it's a good indication of how your communities are participating, whether it's a local census tract or a county or a city or a state, and perhaps as importantly, it also tells us once the self-response operation is over and the door knocking phase begins, how much of the door knocking will be needed in each community. So we'll know at the end of that, as that transition happens, how many households will need to be contacted and counted in person. And of course, the non-response follow-up with door knocking adds greatly to the risk that people will be missed or counted inaccurately. So it's really important to really prioritize self-response. And so that's why we're tracking this close. So we can go to the next slide. So these statistics are a little dated, only because I haven't updated them quite just yet. As I mentioned, every Friday I do a presentation along with Terry Ann Lowenthal. We're working with the Funders Census Initiative and the Census Counts campaign. And so these slides are from last Friday, so they're current through last Thursday. The Census Bureau publishes self-response rates every day at around 3 p.m. Eastern, and we incorporate all of that information. So the numbers have changed a little bit since last Thursday, but not a whole lot. So it's still in the ballpark of what's happening in terms of the response rate trends. So we're just over 50% response nationwide. So half of the housing units that the Census Bureau had contacted initially have sent back their forms. The response rates continue to go up. And one aspect of this is thinking about what the goal is, or the goal post. What should we be trying to achieve in terms of a self-response rate? There are a couple of ways of looking at that. One is, what was the final self-response rate in the 2010 census? Now, the 2010 census was different. It was all mail. There was no internet option. And of course, there was no pandemic in 2010. So it's a little different, but it's still a useful goalpost to think about in terms of what we should be striving for. So if we continue, if the nation continues on the pace that we've been over the past week or so, we will achieve that 66.5% self-response rate by June. Now, you need to think of that in the context of the situation we're in. So as of last Thursday, the self-response operation would have ended were it not for the COVID-19 crisis and the shelter-in-place policies and the concern about not making it easy for people to respond, and worrying also about sending people door to door, which would have started by next week were it not for the COVID situation. So the Census Bureau has dramatically extended the time frame for all of this. And so in some ways, looking back at the 2010 self-response rate is now kind of a moot point, because we really have no historical context for what happens next, because we've never had such an extended time frame for self-response. Now, the non-response follow-up door knocking won't begin until August. That's when it's scheduled to begin. We'll see if it's safe at that time to pursue that and move ahead with that. That may change, we don't know. And the Census Bureau has made the decision to allow people to self-respond all the way through the end of October. So on the one hand, we don't know what that means. On the other hand, it gives us an unprecedented opportunity, understanding, of course, that there are still big challenges in terms of trying to get out to the householders and urge them to respond. But it's an opportunity to really go well beyond even the 2010 final self-response rate, because we have so much more time to do that. And of course, it's all the more important to try to boost the self-response rate, because that means if you self-respond, you don't get a knock at your door from a census taker. And it helps protect their health as well. And it also saves the Census Bureau, i.e. the taxpayers, money. So let's go on to the next slide. And so I don't have a lot of time, but I'll go through some of the highlights. So here you can see how the rates have been proceeding. The red line going across the top are the day-to-day self-response rates at the national level from 2010. The individual lines below that represent the 2020 response rates day by day by state. And the red line in the middle of that is the current self-response rate nationwide for 2020. And so you can see that the red line at the top has kind of gone flat. The curve is flattened, which is not a good thing in this situation. It's better for the other situation. We want the rates to continue to go up. And you can see that the other rates are continuing to go up. So hopefully that trend continues. Go to the next slide, please. And this is a state by state ranking, basically. You can see the states that are doing well at the top and the states that are not doing so well at the bottom. Now I'm going to talk in a little bit about the one big reason why a number of those states are not doing well, because of the update leave operation. But anyway, this gives you a sense of how things are proceeding. And day by day, the ranking is pretty much the same with minor changes here. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about what some of the demographic trends are that we're looking at in relation to response rates. Some differences that we're noticing for areas that receive different types of mailings from the Census Bureau. And then also I'll talk about this update leave situation. And if we have time, I can do a quick demo of how you can access and operationalize or make actionable some of this information using our hard to count now. So next slide, please. So yeah, this is good. So, and actually click through once or twice to highlight some of the items on the table. Good, perfect. So one thing we've been looking not only at the overall response rates, but also trying to understand what the response rates look like in areas with concentrations of historically undercounted populations. So one of those is people of color. And so we've been looking at census tracts that are predominantly one group or another. So the plurality of the tract population is, let's say, non-Hispanic Asian or non-Hispanic Black or non-Hispanic White or Hispanic, which according to the census data can be of any race. And we've also been looking at this, as you can see from the table, what those differences are in cities that are small or large or very large, and also outside states. And so this gives you a kind of bird's eye overview of some of these trends. And remember, what this does not mean is that people or households that are, let's say, predominantly Black or Hispanic, or et cetera, how they are responding. We don't know that yet. All we know are that the response rates in census tracts with a plurality of one of these groups, we know how those response rates look. And so you can see that for large cities over 1 million, the response rates across the board for people of color are low, relatively speaking, much lower than the nationwide rate overall, and lower than non-Hispanic white predominantly populated census tracts. Census tracts across all city sizes that are predominantly Black, non-Hispanic, are also relatively low. and Hispanic also is close there as well. And so again, this information can help highlight your messaging. You can see that the non-Hispanic Asian tracts are predominantly populated by non-Hispanic Asian population are relatively high, although again, in large cities, that tends to go down. So if you can go to the next slide. And then this shows the last time we looked at people of color in relation to response rates was April 9th, whatever week that was, I've lost track. And so you can see what some of the increases are. So for non-Hispanic census tracts that are predominantly non-Hispanic Asian have increased the most in terms of the percentage point increase in response rates from April 9th to April 30th. Although again, at the large city census tracts, the increases haven't been as much. Separate from that, census tracts that are predominantly populated by people who are Hispanic, again, of any race, are also have relatively high increases in terms of percentage point increases, although starting from a somewhat low base, low response rate base. So again, this gives you a sense of perhaps this is in relation to get out the count efforts and very targeted social media campaigns that have been done. We don't know that yet, but it gives you an understanding of how some of these trends are looking. And we're also in the process of producing tables like this by state and also by city. So you'll have access to that information. We'll have it on our website where you can see what this means or what these numbers look like for each particular area. Next slide, please. We've also looked at census tracts that are considered very high risk for undercounting young children. According to the Population Reference Bureau, the response rates for those tracts nationwide tend to be low. And we've a couple of other examples of historically undercounted groups we've looked at are high poverty tracts. According to poverty advocates, they suggested that we look at census tracts where 30% or more residents have incomes below the poverty line. And you can see that the average response rate for those tracts nationwide is also very low and much lower than the nationwide average. And that gap between those tracts and the nationwide average has been increasing. Next slide, please. So let's look also at what the response rates are for areas that receive different types of mailings. So you probably have, if you got the mailing from the Census Bureau, you got one or another of these mailings. Either you received a letter that the Census Bureau considers their internet first mailing, which had the website to go to fill out the form online and the unique ID for your household. Or you received a so-called internet choice packet, which had that letter with the unique ID, but also it included the paper questionnaire. And that was sent mainly to areas that had unreliable internet access or large shares of people, householders over 65. And the idea was to give people the choice if they wanted to do the census old school in effect and fill out the paper questionnaire and mail it back. When we look at the average response rates for tracts that receive the internet choice versus internet first mailings, the response rates for internet first tracts are much higher than internet choice. They're higher than the national average, and the internet choice tracts have, on average, a much lower response rate. And the gap between the rates on average for internet first versus internet choice tracts is widening. We're not sure if that is because of how the Census Bureau chose those tracts based on internet access, or perhaps internet access is a proxy for other demographic characteristics, perhaps low income, perhaps less of education levels, things like that. But nonetheless, it's a reality. And the thing is, you can use our map to not only view what the response rates are, what the geographic patterns are, but you could also see where these mailings were sent. And so you can then incorporate that information into your messaging to know how to communicate best to local areas. Next slide, please. And then real quick, let's just talk for a moment about update leaves. So a small portion of housing units across the country, but in some places a large concentration of them like the states that are listed here and a few others, the Census Bureau decided not to mail to these housing units, but instead, because they were very rural areas, didn't have traditional addresses, or perhaps were seasonal housing, they decided to use their update leave operation, which a census taker was supposed to go to the household, leave a packet, a census packet, which would include the paper questionnaire, update the address on their list, and then the householder would then take that packet on their own whenever they wanted to, and then fill out the questionnaire from there. Because of the COVID situation, the Census Bureau decided early on to suspend this operation. And so households in those areas have had no communication directly from the Census Bureau about exactly how to fill out the census questionnaire. So the response rates, as you might imagine in those areas, are very low by and large. And in some states, it's a big chunk. So when you go back to that slide that had the statewide ranking, you can think of it as some of these states like West Virginia and Alaska and New Mexico have basically artificially low response rates, and would be probably much higher anyway, if the update leave operation had been put into effect. This week, the Census Bureau announced that they are going to restart the update leave operation in 13 states. Interestingly, not New Mexico, but Alaska, West Virginia, and a few others. And so they'll be moving ahead with that starting this week. And hopefully, based on health considerations and coordination with state organizations, will add other states to that operation. So now these households will be receiving the update leave packets, the census packets, and be able to respond directly. So we'll see what that does to the response rates in those areas. Next slide. And actually, so this is just a visual from the map. You can see that these are census tracts for part of the Midwest, part of the South and the Northeast. The tracts that are highlighted in blue have response rates as of a couple of days ago of 50% or more. The tracts that are shaded in brown have response rates of less than 50%. And if you go to the next slide, you can see that we've also mapped the contact strategies, as it were, that the Census Bureau used. The areas in yellow are where the update leave operation was supposed to have happened. And so it's an almost one-to-one match, where the areas in yellow would have been update leave, have very low response rates. And if you look close, we won't do it now, probably don't have time, but the areas in green, which are internet choice mailing areas, also have lower response rates on average, and the areas in purple, where households receive the internet first mailing, tend to have higher response rates. Next slide. And I think that might be it. And so I don't know if we probably don't have time now. So let's, if we have time later, I can do a quick demo of the map, but we can go over.
Thank you, Steve. And can you remind us, when are the weekly updates on the response rates?
Every Friday.
Every Friday. Great. And we'll send out more information to everyone on the webinar on how to register and what time those calls take place. I will turn it over to our next speaker, Jerry, with National Urban League.
Thank you so very much. I'm so happy to be here this afternoon to join you to talk about the 2020 census. I have been privileged to work with AAJC for the past 20 years, initially as a Census Bureau employee during the census 2000, 2010, and the 2020 census. And since 2018, as was mentioned earlier, now on behalf of the National Urban League. As an organization, the National Urban League has stood in solidarity with AAJC and other communities of color on critical census and civil rights issues, including fighting the failed citizenship question struck down by the Supreme Court last year, and more recently, speaking truth to power against xenophobic, racist rhetoric surrounding the coronavirus. The National Urban League is a historic civil rights organization established in 1910, dedicated to the economic empowerment of African Americans in historically underserved urban communities. We conduct our work through a network of 90 local affiliates across 300 communities in 36 states and the District of Columbia, impacting the lives of more than 2 million people nationwide each year. In addition, the National Urban League has been a strong advocate for an accurate census for the past 50 years, starting with the 1970 census. For the National Urban League, the census is a game changer. It's an equalizer. It's about money, power, respect, and representation. Next slide. So, what has the hard-to-count map and the response rate tracker revealed to the National Urban League? Well, we've now entered the 7th week of the 2020 census. In 2018, as was mentioned earlier, the National Urban League launched the 2020 Census Make Black Count initiative that included the establishment of a 2020 Census Black Roundtable. We have found the hard-to-count map and response rate tracker of immense benefit. It gives us a glimpse of how foreign-born populated census tracts are faring in states and localities across the country, so we can pinpoint outreach efforts as it pertains to Black immigrants. It provides an indication of where young children are most at risk of being undercounted. Last decade, 7 out of 10 Black and brown children were missed entirely in the census. It has shown us significant differences in tract level response rates for online responses versus paper, as Steve just mentioned. This is significant because households without internet access were provided paper questionnaires in the first week of the census last March. These households, many African American, have not kept pace with online response rates, so we have to monitor that very closely as it relates to messaging. The response rate tracker also has revealed significant differences between a state's overall response rate, which you have seen on one of the slides that Steve presented, and within state local rates. For example, Michigan's response rate as of yesterday was 64%, but Detroit, Michigan is at 43%. And of course, Michigan could stand to lose a congressional seat as a result of the census response. Critically, it tells us how the non-response follow-up universe is shaping up, with historically undercounted populations, race and ethnic groups becoming more concentrated in tracts with the lowest self-response rates. These tracts, as Steve mentioned earlier, will require more in-person, face-to-face visits to collect responses, which we know will impact data quality, and it has significant undercount implications once you're in that non-response follow-up universe. We really wanted this tool to be able to drill down to determine how African American males were responding across census tracts, since Black men are significantly undercounted in just about every age category between 18 to 49. However, there are limitations with the data, as Steve mentioned, relating to looking at census tracts that are predominantly of one race or ethnicity and not really looking at individual representations. And so it does prevent us from making any broad assessments regarding this population. Of course, Steve could do that a lot more eloquently, do that explanation a lot more eloquently than I just did. Next slide, please. I want to go back, stay here for 1 second. So you notice the enumerator there. When you see in October, it's very likely that enumerator will look very different. That enumerator will wear a mask and will likely have on gloves. And so the enumerator will look very different as it relates to, as a result of the pandemic. And the Census Bureau is now acquiring PPE, personal equipment and such to ensure that their workers are safe and that the public is safe as well. Next slide. So, what are the challenges for the National Urban League as it relates to the pandemic? The primary challenge has been, after 110 years of existence, how can the Urban League continue to provide community empowering services in the midst of this unprecedented pandemic? Like everyone else, Urban League employees are sheltering in place across the country, as are the communities they serve. And yet, the fight for social justice and equality must continue. Neither racism nor inequality take a break. I'm still waiting for it. And neither has the Urban League. But first, let's see what some of the things we have been doing. The National Urban League has been advocating in Congress for the next round of stimulus funding to include priority provisions for small businesses that are minority owned. At the local level, for example, through a partnership with the National Urban League, Ride is helping essential workers get where they need during the pandemic by providing ride codes that the National Urban League and its affiliates will be able to distribute to essential workers and families all over the country. Even more locally, the Urban League of Central Carolinas in Charlotte held its first virtual job fair last month. Job seekers connected online and had a virtual one-on-one meeting with 5 employers, including Walmart, UPS, Atrium Health, and RJ Leeper Construction. McDonald's franchises in the St. Louis area delivered more than $45,000 worth of food to the Urban League of Metropolitan St. Louis to be distributed to people in need. And the National Urban League has just joined the National Basketball Association and a global community of voices in a campaign to support and engage and inspire youth and families and fans in response to the coronavirus pandemic. As for COVID-19 census challenges, my goodness, so I can only say this, the house is on fire. The pendulum has swung away from the 2020 census in every sense. Black people are dying at hugely disproportionate numbers, are out of work, and are afraid. Our organizations, we came to understand, could not keep pushing census and not recognize or speak to the impact of the deadly pandemic on our communities. No one wants to talk about a census when their house is burning down. Civil rights organizations comprising the 2020 Census Black Roundtable have had to divert our attention away from the census momentarily, just for a second, to bring attention to the historic racial disparities and injustices that have contributed to widespread coronavirus cases and diabetes. And we're not talking about, coronavirus cases and deaths, and we're not talking about obesity and diabetes. The census shutdown required National Urban League and diverse stakeholders across the board, including AJC, to rethink census messaging, to assess constantly changing census timelines and operational shutdowns, to engage Census Bureau leadership like never before, and communicate with members of Congress to rethink strategies, messaging, and expectations. And we're all shoulder to shoulder and elbow to elbow on this, if not digitally. We're working with AJC, the Leadership Conference, and we're all together on this as organizations who have the best interests of our communities at stake. The National Urban League was actually one of the first census stakeholder organizations to urge the Department of Commerce to extend time for the public to respond to the census during non-response follow-up. Next slide, please. Mastering the pivot. That's what we're learning. This is a new dance that we don't want to dance. We don't, this is a tough one here, but the Urban League, like so many of our colleagues, including AAJC and all of our stakeholder groups, have been preparing toolkits with all kinds of great ideas. Our affiliate offices, and we're not alone, had plans to open up our offices so that the public and the community could use our computers to participate in the census. All this has been scrapped. And we're using things like teletown halls as one of the modes of outreach to attract thousands of participants to learn both about the census and the coronavirus. And members of the roundtable are having great success with this method, as well as the National Urban League. Just last week, I think Fair Count had a teletown hall on census and had, I think, upwards of 13,000 people on it. And we have certainly had a teletown hall as well with national leaders on our call, and have had like over 3,000 RSVPs, more than 1,000 on the line. So this is a very effective method of outreach. Before the coronavirus, we were co-messaging be counted and vote in 2020. We were telling people, you got to do 2 things. We can do 2 things, everybody. We can vote, but you got to be counted too. Now we have 3 asks: shelter in place, self-respond, and don't forget to vote. So we have to be coronavirus sensitive. We've also had to do a lot of comforting. We did this during Hurricane Katrina, and now with the escalation of racially motivated violence in our communities, we are comforters, all in the midst of this pandemic. And the CDC has reported that Black people constitute 20% of all US coronavirus deaths, even though we are only 12% of the population. At the same time, we have used this as an opportunity to say, you see this lack of hospital beds and health services? You hear these politicians saying they're okay with more deaths in our community. You can change this by being counted. The census provides for fair and equitable representation and federal funding to address some of these needs, some of these critical services. See this and change it. Next slide, please. So how is the Urban League using the hard to count map in our GOTC work? And when I say the Urban League, I'm also referring to the Black Roundtable. I touched a little bit about this earlier, and I'll quickly go through so our next speaker will have time. Fair Count, for instance, is doing amazing work. This is the organization founded by Stacey Abrams. They're using the CUNY response tracker to target outreach. Their field staff in designated zones across Georgia, the state of Georgia, track response rates relative to respective communities to do targeted outreach by way of phone and text banking, as well as Fair Count's letters to the editor program. They're also using data to plan a virtual bus tour, which will target communities with low response rates in hard-to-count counties, as well as those in non-hard-to-count counties that are at risk based on their heat maps. This bus tour was supposed to be an actual bus tour, but of course, with the public health laws in place, they have changed it to a virtual bus tour. The largest committee on civil rights is using the data to target PSA placements, public service announcements. The National Urban League is using the data to get out the count in Black immigrant populations. We're using it to discuss low response rates with local elected officials and congressional leaders. We're using it to inform our 90 National Urban League affiliates of undercounted jurisdictions within their service areas so they can target their outreach. We're also using it to place Facebook ads and to target Wi-Fi spots. Next slide, please. So, reaching hard-to-count populations in urban areas. I think this is my last slide. How are we doing this? Well, we do believe in meeting people where they are. And there's so many things at the local level that can be done. And I have a long list, which I will provide after the call. But people are going to food banks like never before. Get something to stick in the food banks, and children are getting grab and go meals. I know that the Urban League is providing grab and go meals to kids who would have gotten free lunch and free breakfasts at their schools that are no longer open. Put a sticker on those things. Use the messaging specifically about COVID-19 and to encourage social distancing while going online or calling to complete the census, that kind of messaging. Have your library keep their Wi-Fi signals open for people to use outside or in the parking lot to complete the census. Of course, everybody's text banking and phone banking and things like that. You can have response rate challenges by neighborhoods. You can actually start at the neighborhood level. Look at your next door neighbors' websites, and I've seen them on my own next door neighbor sites, notices about census participation. But most importantly, it's important that you monitor these census field updates. They are constantly changing. So what they're doing now, they may have to stop if there's a surge in the virus. The virus is in control, not the Census Bureau. So keep those things in mind. Don't reinvent the wheel. There are things going on that you may not be aware of. And your locally appointed census coordinators are probably doing some webinars or things virtually. Check in with them. And respect the virus. Don't get caught off guard if things unfortunately, if things happen in the fall, as we begin non-response follow-up, we have to be ready and anticipate what the next steps are. So I thank you so much. We've learned some hard lessons throughout all of this, but most important, we have learned and we already knew we are incredibly creative and resilient people who will all come out of this thing in one piece and be counted. So thank you very much for your time today.
Carrie, thank you so much. And I agree, creativity and resilience is something that we've seen from all of our communities, and we will make it out of this stronger. I will turn it over to our next speaker, who is Elena with State Voices.
Great, awesome, thank you. Next slide. Great. So just really quickly for folks who may not know about our network, we are a national network of 23 permanent state-based coalitions focused on creating a more accessible and inclusive democracy at the local level through year-round civic engagement work, and we've been focused on the census for the past couple of years. We provide our network with tools, data, training, and strategic planning support. Next slide. So we use the CUNY Map really in tandem with VAN, the Voter Activation Network database. We really like that the CUNY Map, we like it for many reasons, but we really like that the map helps us to identify tracts with good self-response rates as well as low self-response rates. I put this partial image of Nebraska here on the slide as an example of how our state table in Nebraska is really using the CUNY Hard to Count map to shift their outreach strategies. They had a number of targeted tracts that they've been sending calls and texts throughout the last couple of months. Those are better performing, and so they are now shifting their outreach time to focus on some new tracts that are still lagging behind. I think Jerry mentioned it, the overall state is doing pretty well, but there are still some tracts that are lower performing, and so keeping that in mind is good. We use the VAN to find household phone numbers, email addresses, household addresses, so that we can run, like I said, phone banks, texting, using our digital outreach tools, and then it provides us a great way to store records of conversations, contacts that we've had, and really quantify the work that our campaign is doing. We also have a how to use VAN for GOTC guide that I will make sure that is shared around with everyone after the webinar. Next slide. Awesome. So some challenges and shifts. Yeah, piggybacking off of what Jerry said, there are tons of challenges and we've really had to shift and adapt. These are really just the most recent challenges that COVID-19 has brought to us. So many of our states had in-person events and canvassing planned for their campaigns. We have obviously scratched all of that, canceled in-person events, and are moving to strictly digital organizing with social media, texting, phone calls, and relational tools like Reach or Empower. In this transition, we realized that we had a bit of a capacity need for, just understanding more of these digital tools. And so we hosted a series of digital trainings to beef up our networks and partners' knowledge around how to use the tools, how to run digital programs well, and that has been really helpful. We also are dealing with the challenges that are real and valid of the health and economic concerns. Lots of folks are, top of mind for how they're going to pay bills and if they're going to keep their jobs. And so many of our tables have shifted or included mutual aid support into all the campaign work that they're doing on census and other issues to make sure that they're meeting folks kind of where they are. Similarly, the digital divide is much more noticeable now that we are all digital and we're not doing any in-person events, which has created some shifts and challenges around rural outreach that I will touch on in a second. We have two kind of outstanding things that we're still sorting through. We're trying to think through as a network what the shift in state redistricting timelines may look like if the apportionment data from the Census Bureau is sent to states later than we anticipated and what that means for states. And then we also think that we need some more additional field guidance around how folks should be thinking of census now that the timeline has been extended to October, and there are lots of other civic engagement efforts from now until October. Next slide. Great, so really quickly, just a few examples from the states doing great work. Our tables in Pennsylvania and Massachusetts are hosting huge phone banks with over like 1,000 calls being made. Pennsylvania has set up virtual phone banks with Zoom, and so their partners can all kind of build some community, troubleshoot together, and I think that's just a really great example of using the digital tools that we have available. Louisiana has created a digital organizing toolkit, really with some good messaging for the state, state-specific messaging. Florida and Wisconsin partners have created some mutual aid work and tied that in with the census campaigns that they're running, again, to just validate the real concerns that folks have. And then in Virginia, the table has created a tracker to share with partners based on the CUNY Hard to Count map that really shows the work of the partners and where the tracts are high self-response scores versus areas that still need a lot of support. Next slide. Great, and then reaching rural households, we definitely do not have this fully figured out. We are still, trying to think through what the best approach is, but here are some of our organizing efforts. We are obviously continuing to make phone calls to the rural areas and rural households. Some states are sending postcards and mailers with information about how to get counted and how to fill out the census form. States like Montana, Nevada, and New Mexico are in direct consultation with the tribes to see what they are recommending for Get Out the Count outreach and how they can support in that. Montana is also currently thinking through a pop-up idea. They bought a ton of hotspots, and so they're trying to think through what a socially distant pop-up could look like that would provide Wi-Fi, internet access in a safe location for folks who would otherwise not be able to complete the form online. And then lastly, just thinking through some more traditional avenues like local radio stations, local media, as a way to reach folks who listen to those. And then lastly, our advocacy opportunities. These are things that we are thinking for maybe 2030 or some of our voter registration efforts in the future, but thinking through expanding our broadband access, what that could look like in states with really rural populations, and then exploring some plus codes for non-traditional addresses that would give them some type of address. So kind of fixing those two problems, definitely not solving anything in the immediate, but thinking kind of a long-term solution. And with that, I will turn it back over to Bessie.
Lena, thank you. And I will turn it over to Rima, who is our last speaker.
Thanks, Bessie, and thanks so much, Elena, Jerry, and Steve. So hi, everyone. My name is Rima Roy. I'm the Program Associate for Census and Civic Engagement at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AJC. Today, I'm going to do a quick refresher and share some new messaging tactics for the census, since a lot of people's outreach is now going to be extended until October 31st. And if folks want to see a deeper dive on our messaging research, please feel free to check out our previous webinar that we did, which was a deep dive on messaging, and we'll definitely make sure to include that in our follow-up email. So as you know, census data provides our communities with an opportunity to better understand ourselves and tools to engage our elected officials in advocating for support and solutions for our community's needs. The 2010 census showed us growing and new emerging communities in states where we had not seen a large presence before. The 2020 census can provide us with a new wealth of data and knowledge. For this to happen, we need a full and accurate count of the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities. So as you can see from this graphic that we saw some new emerging populations in states such as Nevada, Arizona, North Carolina, and North Dakota. And we saw the highest growth from 2000 to 2010. And then we saw that in the 2010 census showed us that the Asian American population is the fastest growing racial group in the United States, and that the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander population in California grew 29% between 2000 and 2010. So we broke up our messaging research into two legs. So the first leg was done through these focus groups in these languages. So we had a Mandarin group, a South Asian, we were doing Hindi speaking group, a Korean group, a Southeast Asian group, and then we had a mixed group which was conducted in English. And then our second leg of our messaging research, we did it through an online survey that we sent out to 1,600 AANHPIs around the country. And here is the demographic profile of the folks we surveyed. There's a lot of diversity here in terms of ethnicity, region, education, attainment level, age, etc. So you can see all that here. So the first thing we learned is that a majority, around 55% of our population, have not heard anything about the upcoming 2020 census. So this really showed us that we really have our work cut out for us. It really made it clear that it's essential that we continue to educate our communities so they know what the census is and why it's so important to our community. Knowledge of the upcoming census is highest among the Indian American and Korean American groups, which is still less than a majority, while it is lowest among Japanese Americans and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders. We also saw that less than half, around 47% of AANHPIs know that everyone in the country, regardless of immigration status, is required to fill out the census. So this was also really important for us to know in terms of our outreach. This is a common misinformation point that I've seen on social media. So from this data, we really learned that we really need to continue highlighting to folks that the census is important for everyone, regardless of immigration status. And these are the top testing messages that we had within our community. So really a strong emphasis on family and children, specifically in the Indian American community, helped in the past, resources, and then visibility. And then the visibility message really stuck out for the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities. And then in terms of preference for the form, most AANHPI said they were most likely to complete the census form using either the online option and the paper option. So the phone option was not as popular, and unsurprisingly, the door knocking option was not popular. And then in terms of trusted messengers, more than 1 in 3, 34% of AANHPIs gave a great deal of attention to friends and family as a source of information about the US Census. Also, other sources of information include children's schools, teachers and school officials, local public health officials, including nurses and doctors. These were the most trusted sources of information. And then surprisingly to us, religious institutions did not rank as high. So these are some of the key takeaways. What we need to know is that we need to continue to raise awareness of the 2020 census, since less than half know who should participate. There's a preference for both the paper and online options. The top messages evoke use of family and resources and use of children, which is more ethnic group dependent. And there's a preference for diversity in advertising, and that a lot of people need to be educated that the census is for everyone, regardless of immigration status. So we've been amplifying our census messaging to really continue motivating people to fill out the form by using subjects relevant to our communities today, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. So we've really been amplifying that census data is used to allocate funding for and help government agencies with planning for future natural disasters and emergencies such as pandemics. So these are two examples of graphics that we've created for social media. So this one reads that census data are critical for emergency planning for events such as natural disasters and pandemics like COVID-19. Make sure your community is counted so it gets the funding it needs for future emergencies. Fill out the form today. So we have similar graphics in our APM toolkit, which Bessie had mentioned earlier. if you're interested in using this toolkit to highlight the census, definitely please sign up for it. And we'll include the sign up in our follow-up email. The Census Bureau is also, they have their own page on how census data is currently being used for COVID-19 efforts. So for example, census statistics are helping identify counties with large at-risk populations such as the elderly. So I will also include this link in our follow-up email as well. And then lastly, we have also been using the Census Bureau response rates dashboard as a motivation tactic. So this is a graphic that we made a few weeks ago. The data is a little bit old because it's from a few weeks ago, but we use this data to show what states had the highest response rates at the time, and then highlighted which states have the highest Asian American populations, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander populations, or both. So this graphic then asks folks, is your state one of these top 10 states? So, and if not, then fill out the census so your state is accurately counted. I've seen several counties, cities, and state governments use this tactic around social media to create a kind of friendly competition, and they're getting a lot of impressions and likes across social media. So it's a really useful way to get out the count. And I will definitely include the link for this dashboard in our follow-up email as well. So now we really just want to open it up to questions. As Bessie and I mentioned before, this presentation will be recorded and we'll be sending around the slides in our follow-up email. For questions, people can either jot them down into the question box or raise your hand if you need to be unmuted. So this first question that we have is considering, and this is from Aaron Wilford, considering that this is the first time the census can be completed online, do you know why the Census Bureau did not send each household the internet choice option? Jerry, do you think you would be able to answer this? Or Steve?
I think that's an excellent question. I do. I don't have an answer as to why the Census Bureau did not give everyone a paper questionnaire. Is that the question?
Yeah, basically, yeah, that's basically it.
I don't know if it's a money consideration. You know, I think it probably has to do with cost and the expectation that because we are in a digital society, that more people, that the online response rate, you know, would have been gangbusters. I just believe that it's a cost issue more than anything. And if my panelists have any other words on that, I'd love to hear it.
This is Steve. I think I could add to that a little bit. So I think, Jerry, you're right. The reason to try to have most households respond online is for cost purposes. And actually, the online response has been really high. The vast majority of the responses that the Bureau has received so far have been through the online portal. The Census Bureau understood, though, that, of course, a lot of people don't have access to the internet, and in those areas, they sent them the paper questionnaire. But then they also, I think at some point, they decided to print enough paper questionnaires to send to every household just in case. But they haven't needed to do that because the internet response has been so high. But then the Census Bureau over the past couple of weeks has been sending out a follow-up mailing to non-responding households, and that has included the paper questionnaire. And actually, when we see on the map, we track for each state, city, county, census tract, tribal land, et cetera, the trend of the responses on a day-by-day basis. And you can see over the last week or two, in a lot of places, not everywhere, but a lot of places, the responses have gone up dramatically, primarily because of mail responses, on top of already high internet responses. So I'm sure the Census Bureau will be doing an extensive evaluation of this exact question afterwards. But we're kind of in the thick of it now, and so we're stuck with what we have.
Yeah, and I think we should also, Steve, we should also, and Aaron, consider this the future. The future is now, and the next census in 2030 probably won't look a lot like what we just went through today. I think this is the future of the census, perhaps, and this is a good experiment, for lack of a better word, to see how effective this will be come 2030.
Great, thank you so much, Jerry and Steve. I'm just going to answer one more question. Can you remind us, this is from Jin Bei, can you remind us when the research on AANHPI was conducted? This was conducted in 2018. So unfortunately, we're a little over time right now, so we're not going to have time to get to everyone's questions, but I've laid out the slide with everyone's contact information, and I'll send this contact information in our follow-up email as well. So if people want to send these questions to any of our speakers or to AJC, we'll be happy to respond. So thank you so much for everyone for attending, and thank you so much for our panelists. And yeah, Bessie, do you have any final words?
A huge thank you to Steve, Jerry, Elena, and Rima for their presentations on this webinar. And as a reminder, everyone will get a copy of the presentation and recording. And as Rima mentioned, please don't hesitate to email us your questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.